Handling asynchronous state in React can be pretty confusing. Having struggled through it myself, I feel like I have a good grasp on it now, so I figured I would share what I've learned. Here, I have an Next.js application to make it easy for me to showcase this example. First, we have a route for the API we're going to test with. As you can see, it's a simple get API that returns a simple message and a status code. On the right here, I've defined a page, which is defined here. I've set up a couple states on this page. Data will hold the data that comes back from the server. Loading is a flag that is used to show the state of us waiting for the data to come back from the server. And error, if there's any errors, we can show those errors. And here at this fetch test, this is the method that actually makes the fetch call and calls the various set states that we need to make sure that the template below gets updated. And here we have a use effect. This in particular tripped me up when I was first learning how to work with this. My default behavior, and maybe it is for a lot of you, but I always assumed that you needed to make this an async function so that you can await this function. And that caused issues, obviously. It wasn't obvious to me at the time, but the way to think about this is like, you want your async methods to be fire and forget here, not to like await next. They just kind of have to fire. And if you need something to go in a certain order, you have to do that in its own async method call like this. So as you can see here, I have two awaits. I want to fetch and then await to get the data out of that fetch. So this just happens, and the state that gets called just gets updated when it's ready. This is just going to fire and forget. And here's a template using Tailwind for the templating styles. And yeah, as you can see, there's nothing crazy. It's just showing a heading, the status, a response type, and a button. And you notice that the button is the fetch test right here as well. So it's going to call the same method as when on load. So if I refresh this page, see when idle, you saw loading for a split second there, and then it returned data receive, which is the message that I'm sending back. You'll notice that when I hit this as well, that's exactly the same thing that happens. And you'll notice too that if you fetch while we're offline, an error was received and that the message was that it failed to fetch. Let me bring it back and it works again. So that's the gist of working with async. The key note for me was that you have to separate your async out into a different function, call that in a non-awaited fashion inside of use effect if you want to use it in a use effect. Or obviously if you just want to use it somewhere else, it'll just work just fine that way. But that was very confusing to me at first, but I hope that's something that I'm getting across to someone out there who was confused as well. But let's take it a step further. So I have step 1 here, but we also have a step 2. Because I found that as I was working with this method of fetching, I thought to myself, do I really have to set up these state methods over and over for any use case where I'm going to use async? Like, let's say we have a component with maybe 3, maybe 4 async calls, and am I going to have to set up a bunch of state methods that are named accordingly in order to handle those? You also want to, generally, if you run into that, you want to break up your components and have the async be handled in separate components, most likely. But you do have to rewrite a lot of things every time you need to do this, which is annoying. Now, here I have a hook that I've created called use async. Now, I created use async before I knew that there was actually a lot of other implementations of the same exact thing. I literally called it use async because I came to that same conclusion that a lot of other developers did too. So if you search online, you'll probably find other implementations that look very, very similar to what I've done. But I'm just going to go through here with you the way I've done it, so that you can kind of get an idea of how you can actually modify it to suit your needs if it makes more sense, or if you just want to use async with someone else's implementation that's better tested than mine. That's totally cool too. But just so you can walk with me on this path here, it's very nice to know to how to do this, I found. So here we have the call to use async, which returns all these values. So the data loading and error states, just like before, same flags, and their default values. And then the invoker gets returned, and I'm just going to rename that to fetch test just to match what's going on here. And then I pass in this use async. The first generic value here is the type of the data that should be getting returned from the server. And that's what the second argument is here, is the default type that variable, the data variable, gets set as initially, so that it's the same type when it comes back from the server. So if you have a more complex type, you want to set that there and then set a nice default version of that type here. That's how I would approach it, at least. The second value is the type of the metadata that you want to pass into your invoker function. So you could say something like that, and then you could actually use this data whenever you call a method. So the idea is that, like, let's say I called fetch test, and I had some metadata here to do stuff. If I wanted to do something unique between different calls of the same fetch function, I could have access to that metadata within this function, thanks to the way this hook works. But in this use case, it's super simple. You don't need to actually do anything like that. I'll go ahead and update this to show step 2. Again, same exact experience. So yeah, as you can see here, is like, it's basically the same exact function, with the exception that I'm not having to do these set data, set loading, set error, so on and so forth. It's automatically doing all that for me, aside from reset. Reset's what I'm calling here, which is basically doing what these things are. But again, it's like less work to do with just one line call. So the basic gist is that whatever you return from this promise function is what gets set as the data here. So pretty straightforward. So if we go to the use effect, looks exactly the same as it does on page 1, step 1. And this is literally the exact same template as on page 1. As you can see, I'm not really changing anything at all. And as you can see, if you, I just noticed I didn't actually update the title there. So there's one difference. But, you know, it's very subtle, but you'll notice that it is saying loading and showing that. And if I go offline, it's going to show that error, just like before. So how did I do this? Hopping over to async, use async, I have this method I've created. And really the hardest thing that was to understand about making this was like the type systems. If you're not a TypeScript person, you prefer to use JavaScript, it'll probably be easier for you to write. But I wanted to make sure everything was the proper type to make sure that you get the nice autocomplete as you work through things. So yeah, I just wanted to keep it the same thing. So pardon me. So yeah, basically this T is what I mentioned before. It's that type that's going to be returned from the server. And U is the type of the metadata that you want to go in. So in this case, I set it to any, so I didn't really need to do anything with that. And then you pass in the initial data, which is right here. It could be an empty object, it could be a default object, it could be true, it could be false, any value that you want, as long as you've set the correct type. And you might notice that this looks very similar to what we have over here, because it pretty much is. I pretty much just copied and pasted from here, moved it to here. So I can use async and get these states set up right away without having to do anything extra. And then here is where a lot of the automatic stuff happens for us. So the invoker is what you get passed back to you on the other side here. And what it does is it takes in the method that you passed in, calls the method with the metadata that you pass into it at the time, and calls the set error. It resets the error for you automatically, obviously. It sets loading to true, makes the asynchronous call. When it comes back, it sets the data back to what you returned from the method, which in this case is the string that comes back from the server. And then it says data loading to false. And if there's an error, it shows an error or sets an error. And basically the same functionality, but you don't have to repeat it every single time. And here's just a nice handy reset method if you want to use it. And all that just gets pulled back into the return statement, and that's it. You just have that now. You can just, for instance, if I wanted to make another call to the server, I just paste it, and at this point, I'll probably just rename to other data, you know. It could be in the same file, but as I mentioned before, you might want to consider breaking things up at that point. But now you have a brand new way to other reset. So yeah, as you can see, now I have a whole new thing. I can change the test to something else. I can use the invoker here to make a call to the server, and I'll just update this to what I need it to be for that function. And now I have the same state that I can use in the template and have it react the way I need to. This obviously makes the template a little bit more complex. You know, you're waiting on two different states. You might be resolving things together. But anyway, this is just the gist I wanted to get across of how to use your own hooks to your own advantage to stop having to duplicate your code so much if you have that problem. And also how async works for managing state in general. So I hope this was useful, and have a good day. Thanks for watching.